I used to work as a tow truck driver in Nevada. The desert is quiet at night, too quiet. They call Highway 50 the loneliest road in America for a reason. It stretches through the middle of nowhere, nothing but sand, rocks, and the occasional rusting car wreck. One summer night, I got a call from dispatch about an abandoned RV. A couple had rented it for a road trip. Their families hadn't heard from them in days. The rental company tracked the GPS and found it parked in the middle of the desert, off a dirt road near Austin, Nevada. When I arrived, the RV sat in complete silence. The doors were open. The engine was cold. I stepped inside and the air smelled stale, like dust and something else, something rotten. Couple's things were still there. Clothes, food, a phone on the counter with a dead battery. Even their shoes were by the door like they had just stepped out for a moment, but they weren't there. I checked around. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no broken windows. Just an RV, left behind like they had vanished into thin air. I radioed for help. The sheriff arrived an hour later. He didn't look surprised. "This isn't the first time," he said. He told me stories. Over the years, other travelers had disappeared the same way. Always RVs, always near this stretch of road. No bodies, no answers, just empty vehicles, waiting to be found. This made no sense. How did they disappear without a trace? Puzzled, I went to the bar, and some of the locals were talking about something called the Watchers. Things in the desert that don't like visitors. They said if you camp too long, you'll hear knocking on your RV at night. If you open the door, you won't come back. One of the people mentioned that they saw the Watchers one day. He basically described as tall, emaciated figures, almost human but not quite. Their limbs are too long, their fingers too thin, and their movements unnaturally slow until they're not. Their skin is pale and dry, blending into the desert sand at dusk. Their faces? That's the worst part. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin, until they get close. Then if you stare long enough, their faces seem to shift, as if they're trying to mimic something or someone. Some say they don't walk like us. They glide, their feet barely touching the ground. Others say they whisper, but no one remembers what they said. Confused and honestly a bit scared, Nevada is known to have a lot of sightings of aliens and mysterious creatures, but this sounded very strange and eerie. Anyways, I decided to drive away as I don't really believe in ghosts anyway. But as I drove away, I checked my mirror and it was almost as if there was something watching me or moving. I couldn't tell what it was. The Watchers that they were talking about? My paranoia intensified as I just floored it and decided I'm just gonna head to Vegas to chill out and have a few drinks and maybe play a few rounds at the casino. A year after that night, I quit my job as a tow truck driver. But the desert never left me. I still thought about that RV, about the missing couple, about what the sheriff said. Then one evening, I got a call from an old friend, Jake. He was a trucker who often drove through Nevada. His voice was shaky. "You ever hear about the Watchers?" he asked. I felt my stomach tighten. Why? I pulled over to sleep last night near the same place they found that RV. Middle of nowhere. No cars, no lights, just me in the desert. He paused. Something knocked on my door. My hands went cold. Was it a tweaker? No. His voice dropped to a whisper. It knocked 3 times. Slow, heavy, like it wanted me to open the door. A long silence passed between us. "What did you do?" I finally asked. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then I heard footsteps. They circled my truck. Slow, careful. I wanted to look, but something told me not to. At this point, I had my gun and my flashlight ready and I was ready for a fight, but the knocking stopped. Of course, I couldn't sleep that night. In the morning, there were footprints in the sand, a dozen, maybe more, all around my truck. I didn't know what to say. "That's not the worst part," Jake said. "Before I left, I checked my dash cam. It was running all night, but the footage? Completely blank from midnight to sunrise, just static." A chill ran down my spine. "Something is out there," Jake said. "Something that doesn't want to be seen." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that RV, about the missing people, about Jake's story, and about what the sheriff said. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. A few months after Jake's call, I met a woman named Erin at a bar in Ely. She was a travel blogger, always looking for strange places to write about. I told her about the RV, about the Watchers. She didn't believe me. "They're just stories," she said, sipping her beer. "Probably just weirdos messing with travelers. No, I'm telling you, this shit is serious and you need to be very careful, especially in the desert." A week later, she drove out there, alone. I got a text from her that night. "Camping near Highway 50, no cars for miles, it's beautiful out here." An hour later, "I think someone's outside my tent." Then nothing. I called. No answer. No, not this bullshit again. I barely slept that night. The next morning I drove out there following the GPS location she sent. It took me down a dirt road, deep into the desert, the kind of place where the silence presses against you, where you feel like you shouldn't be there. Her car was still there, tent unzipped, sleeping bag inside, no tracks leading away, no sign of a struggle, just emptiness. I circled the campsite, calling her name. My voice barely carried in the still desert air. Her car was locked. Her phone sat on the front seat, battery dead. The tent flap swayed gently, though there was no wind. Something felt wrong, kind of wrong that makes your stomach twist, that makes the air feel heavier. I checked her camera. The last photo she took was of the desert at dusk. A beautiful shot, deep orange sky melting into the endless stretch of sand. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the fading light, I saw them. Thin figures standing in the distance, tall, motionless, watching. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows cast by the setting sun. But as I zoomed in, the details became clearer. Too clear. They weren't trees. They weren't rocks. They were standing there, facing the camera, facing Aaron. I turned to look at the horizon. Nothing. Just the wind and sand. But the silence had changed. It felt deeper now, like the desert was holding its breath, like something was waiting. I called the sheriff. He didn't ask many questions, just sighed and said, "I told her not to go." He sent a deputy, but they didn't stay long. Just took some notes, asked me if I wanted to file a report. I told them about the photo. The deputy didn't even look at it. He just shook his head and muttered, "Some folks go missing out here. Always have." That night I stared at the picture for hours, zooming in, trying to make sense of what I saw. The more I looked, the more certain I became. They weren't people, and they weren't gone. I could feel them, watching, waiting, and then I noticed something else. The last photo Aaron took, it wasn't just of the desert. It wasn't just of them. It was taken from inside her tent, which meant she knew they were there, and she had nowhere to run. I closed the laptop and shut off the lights, but it didn't help. Even in the darkness of my room, I still felt them. I knew one day they'd come for me too. I couldn't sleep after seeing that last photo. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those thin, faceless figures standing in the desert watching. I needed answers. I started digging. Old newspaper articles, missing persons reports, even conspiracy forums. What I found? It went back further than Aaron, further than Jake. People had been disappearing in that part of Nevada for decades. A retired journalist named Richard Langley had written about it in the 90s. He called them the Watchers of the High Desert. According to his articles, hikers, truckers, even entire families in RVs had vanished near Highway 50, always under strange circumstances. Their vehicles were found, belongings untouched, like they had just stepped outside and never came back. Langley believed it had something to do with Area 51. He claimed the government knew about the Watchers, that they weren't just some desert legend, but something real, and not entirely human. Then, in 1998, Langley himself disappeared. His last known whereabouts? A gas station off Highway 50. The clerk remembered him acting paranoid, muttering about things in the desert that weren't supposed to exist. His car was found abandoned on a dirt road a few miles from where I had found Aaron's tent. No body, no tracks, just gone. The deeper I looked, the more unsettling it became. A declassified CIA document from the 1960s referenced an unexplained biological presence near military testing sites in Nevada. The file was mostly redacted, but one phrase stood out. Ongoing surveillance necessary, non-human entities observed. Entities, not people, not animals, something else. Then I came across something worse. A forum post from a man claiming to be a former military contractor. He said the government wasn't studying the Watchers. They were hiding them. According to him, the Watchers aren't extraterrestrial visitors. They've always been here. Ancient. Buried deep beneath the desert for centuries. Something woke them up. And now, they watch us. He ended his post with a warning. If you see them, don't move, don't run, just pretend you don't notice them. The moment you acknowledge them, it's already too late. I leaned back in my chair, my skin cold. The desert outside my window felt darker now, stretching for miles beyond the safety of the town. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, even here, they were watching. The Watchers weren't just seen in the Nevada desert, they were discovered. I found an old interview with an ex-Air Force engineer named Harold Greaves. He worked at a classified site near Groom Lake in the 1950s, before it became known as Area 51. Greaves spoke about an excavation gone wrong. It started with nuclear tests. In the 1940s and 50s, the US government detonated bombs in the Nevada desert, miles away from civilization. They weren't just testing weapons, they were digging. In 1953, a detonation unearthed something strange, a massive underground chamber hidden beneath layers of rock and sand, a cavern that shouldn't have been there. Inside, they found tall, humanoid figures embedded in the walls, their bodies petrified, almost fossilized. Greaves claimed the scientists thought they had found ancient remains, that the creatures had been trapped underground for thousands, maybe millions of years. But then, one of them moved, not fast, not suddenly, just a slow, imperceptible shift, as if waking up after an eternity of sleep. The entire site was shut down overnight. Military teams sealed the cavern, and anyone who had worked on the excavation was either reassigned or silenced. But it was too late. The Watchers had woken up. Reports of tall, thin figures lurking in the desert began shortly after. First, it was only near the restricted area. Then it spread. Sightings near Groom Lake, Rachel, Tonopah, even as far as Eli. And the missing people? They all had one thing in common. They had seen the Watchers. Greaves believed the creatures weren't extraterrestrial, but something far older, something that had always been here, long before humans, long before history, something that had been buried for a reason. I stared at my screen, heart pounding. I thought about Erin, about the last photo she took. The Watchers weren't visitors, they were prisoners, and now, they were free. The government tried to bury the truth. After the excavation at Groom Lake in 1953, everything was locked down. The cavern was sealed with explosives, burying the Watchers once again. The surviving scientists and engineers were either silenced or reassigned to unrelated projects. Any documents mentioning the discovery were marked top secret and hidden deep within classified archives. But something went wrong. Over the next few years, reports of strange lights and moving shadows in the desert began increasing. Radar operators at nearby military bases started detecting unexplained movements, tall, thin figures wandering the dunes at night, only to vanish without a trace. Then, the disappearances started. First it was locals, hikers, drifters, lone travelers, people who wouldn't be missed. Then, entire military patrols started going missing. Some never returned. Others were found days later, wandering the desert in a daze, unable to speak, their eyes black and hollow, their bodies withered like dried husks. Whispers spread among classified personnel. Scientists and security officers stationed at Area 51 spoke in hushed voices about them, the figures that watched from the hills, just at the edge of visibility. They moved with impossible silence, appearing and disappearing without warning. The official reports said nothing. The disappearances were dismissed as desert accidents. The base even ran disinformation campaigns, encouraging rumors about UFOs to divert attention from the real problem. But somewhere along the line, they lost control. In the late 1970s, satellite images picked up anomalies, large humanoid figures casting long shadows in restricted airspace. Special forces were deployed, armed with experimental weapons. None of them returned. By the 1990s, leaked documents from former intelligence officers hinted at something even more terrifying. The Watchers were no longer contained to the desert. Eyewitness accounts described sightings near highways, in small towns, even outside of Las Vegas. Some claimed to have seen them standing in the dark corners of their rooms, watching them sleep, only to vanish the moment they were fully awake. The government still denies everything. But the truth is out there now. They tried to hide it, they failed. And the Watchers, they're still here.